is the co-owner of the Siskiyou Ecological Services and Klamath Siskiyou Native Seed, and is the Conservation Chair for the Siskiyou Chapter of NPSO. She was co-author of Native Pollinator Plants for Southern Oregon and an editor of the Siskiyou Crest Hikes, History and Ecology book, which is a great book. She's an avid backpacker and has monitored public land grazing allotments on the Siskiyou Crest for a decade as a volunteer with the Grazing Reform Project. Suzie has lived off-grid in a private land inholding with the National Forest at the base of the Siskiyou Crest for 18 years and is surrounded by public land grazing allotments. Before we get to Suzie, we have a really quick update by Cecile, who's been gracious enough to join us for a few minutes to talk about shiny geranium and her work in our region on shiny geranium. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pass the slides over to Cecile for 5 to 10 minutes. And I think we had in our agenda for today set aside a few minutes for Cecile's questions, but I think we could also just put them in the chat and save them for the end, unless it's like, you know, some kind of burning realization. I don't know. So go ahead and share your screen, Cecile, and I'll turn myself off.
Thank you. About a year ago, I gave a talk to NPSO about shiny geranium. Its physiology, ecology, how to treat it, how to identify it from common lookalikes. Today, we've only got 10 minutes, so we'll do a quick refresher on those topics. My main concern, though, is how we can ensure that our intact Klamath Siskiyou forests, full of native plant diversity and abundance, doesn't become in 50 years an ecosystem taken over by a particularly aggressive invasive or group of invasives. Shiny geranium is a beautiful plant, as you can see. It was planted in the Willamette Valley in the 1970s. A garden escapee, its seeds naturally dispersed to prairies, savannas, oak woodlands, grasslands throughout the Pacific Northwest into Washington, and thrived in these habitats. Now shiny geranium is so widespread there in many places, it makes no logical sense to treat it. I work throughout California doing botany and often wonder with my colleagues what these lands used to be like before the invasion of the weeds, many of them non-native annual grasses, bromus, hordeum. Shiny geranium has the potential to become one of those invasives in the Klamath Siskiyou forests. Tula Rebhan from Friends of Wagner Creek and I spent weeks this winter surveying for shiny geranium on private lands near Yank Gulch in Talent. This area was chosen based on proximity to a known shiny geranium BLM site. We engaged with and educated landowners, enlisted their help to control this invasive. They need our help to make this happen. Last winter, BLM botanist Forrest Guana, retired Forest Service botanist Wayne Raleigh, and I spent time surveying for shiny geranium on BLM lands in the Forest Creek area in Rouge in the Applegate. We've learned that we need a community to control the spread of this invasive. And I am coming to you, to native plant people, to ask you to learn to identify shiny geranium and educate others and report it if you find it. Tell me, tell our cooperative weed management area folks. To volunteer. There are really a lot of diverse needs to control the spread of this invasive. I am here tonight because I have never seen an invasive like this one in the Klamath Siskiyou. Here we have shiny geranium seedlings carpeting the forest floor in the two areas I just talked about, Ruche in the Applegate and Yank Gulch in Talent. These are the two areas with the largest populations of shiny geranium in Southwest Oregon. And please note, these photos were taken one in December and one in January. Shiny geranium comes up in the late fall and winter after our first strong rains. Shiny geranium thrives in Doug fir forests, mixed conifer forests, conifer hardwood forests in our Klamath Siskiyou Mountains. It does well in openings, full sun, to about an 80% canopy cover. So a lot of shade. It thrives in shade. It loves moisture. It takes over in those kinds of habitats. Does well, really well in north and east facing slopes. And these moist northeast facing slopes, shady sites lead to high shiny geranium densities. It's also often found along ephemeral creeks and streams, again for the same reason, moisture, some shading. Shiny geranium is not a plant that follows disturbance nor compacted soils. It jumps right into pristine, undisturbed habitats with rich soils and organic material. So here we have an opening in our forest. And I just want to point out this small opening has hundreds of thousands of shiny geranium seedlings. So why so many seedlings? In a study, it was found that after 12 months in dry storage, 99% of shiny geranium seeds germinated. In another study, one done at the Ridgefield National Wildlife Refuge in Washington, shiny geranium was basically observed to have 60 to 730 viable seeds in a plant. So there's this exponential seed effect. If one plant can yield 400 seeds, in the subsequent year, those 400 plants will become 160,000 plants. And 99.9% of those seeds germinate. So this site is along Yank Gulch in Talent. And just want to point out that shiny geranium seeds have headed down Yank Gulch, downstream to Wagner Creek, to Bear Creek, to the Rogue. And it is terrifying. So as I've pointed out, these photos have been taken mostly in December and January. And shiny geranium is a winter annual. These seedlings germinate after the first substantial fall rains in November, December, and January. And if you think about that time period, our forest floor has lots of bare ground. The natives have withered and gone underground. There's plenty of space to occupy, and shiny geranium just takes up that space. By spring, the natives find their space occupied. They've been outcompeted. And in time, it clearly, you can see shiny geranium dominates. Okay, so we're gonna move on to identification. So shiny geranium has a lookalike in our valley, one that acts very different ecologically. It doesn't take over forests, doesn't take over the forest floor. actually likes disturbed soils, likes compacted soils, and you probably have this plant somewhere in your yard. So Geranium male or dove foot geranium looks really similar to shiny geranium. And so let's see, how can we identify shiny geranium? So in this top photo, you can see shiny geranium has 5 petals. Simple, 5 petals. They are unlobed, they look like 5 petals. And the vegetation doesn't have these soft, downy hairs. You will find these like single bristly hairs coming off shiny geranium vegetation, but not this soft, downy, snuggly kind of hair. So geranium male, you can see the hairs. You can see the hairs on the calyx over here, on the stem, some on the leaves, more on the calyx over here, very soft, hairy. And the petals, check out those petals. They are deeply lobed. They don't look like 5 petals. They look like 10 petals. So I really believe these 2 characters are what you need to determine these 2 species from one another. And also know that shiny geranium will act like an invasive. So if you see a plant with these characteristics that's acting like an invasive in the shade, you should be suspicious. So just a compilation of some photos to show you shiny geranium. Again, the flower has 5 petals. The vegetation doesn't have soft downy hairs. Whereas dovefoot geranium, you can see those nice, long, soft, fuzzy hairs, and you can see what looks like 10 petals. Okay, so where is shiny geranium in Southwest Oregon, and how much is there? So in the Rouge area in the Applegate, the BLM has about 130 acres of shiny geranium in the forest. Lots of surveys have been done, probably more can be done, and only some treatment has taken place, and that treatment probably hasn't been consistent enough. On private lands in Rouge, we really don't know what the situation is. We need to do more surveys. I believe that there are 2 landowners with shiny geranium that have done some treatment. So in Talent, in the Wagner Creek and Yank Gulch area on BLM land, so the BLM has not been recently surveyed. It's basically unsurveyed. But what's really good news is that in the future, there will be, within this year, there will be a survey on BLM land. And about 15 years ago, there was 35 acres known. And I would say at this point, at a minimum, that has become 150 acres. On forest floor land, and as of yet, no real treatment has taken place. So on private land in Talent in Wagner Creek and Yank Gulch, Tula and I did surveys this winter, and we found 10 landowners with together about 150 acres of shiny geranium. Treatments as of yet have not taken place, and there are a lot more future surveys planned. So in the Galice area on BLM lands, there are a number of small sites, and treatments have taken place. I think they are probably consistent. On private land in the Galice area, it's really unknown. It is important to check and see. I would say on BLM land as well, surveys need to take place just to make sure that there aren't some giant patches in the forest in managed stands that are there, just reproducing. So in Gold Hill on BLM land, there's also some multiple small sites, some along the floodplain of the Rogue River. And again, surveys still should take place on private land and on BLM land. Okay, so I just want to point out the difficulty of treating an annual on the forest floor in our complex forests. They are multi-layered. There's varied topography. There's lots of leaf litter, lots of organics, mosses for shiny geranium to hide in. I really do not think there is any way we can eradicate shiny geranium. I simply hope that we can find a way to control this species. And so in forests, really, I think the only course of action is using herbicides. And there's an option of chemical and organics. If you have shiny geranium on your property and you've got flat lands, sheet mulching is a great way to go. If you have a small patch, you absolutely can pull. Just get all the roots and make sure it does not go to seed. Okay, so if we are to control this plant species, what needs do we have? So we absolutely need to do more surveys. We need to get a better idea of the entire picture. We need to get partners involved in this effort. So this is really good news. A shiny geranium working group is going to restart, and it is going to be hosted by the Jackson and Josephine County Coordinated Weed Management Areas Coordinator, Amy Wilson. So thank you, Amy Wilson. And we have a lot of agencies. Agencies have people on staff that are knowledgeable about invasives, knowledgeable about natural resource management. We need to engage with these folks and invite them to join in this effort. The BLM, the Oregon Department of Agriculture, Jackson County Soil and Water, OSU Extension, so much knowledge there. We need them. So funding, we absolutely need funding to treat. And thank you to Tula. Tula and I submitted a second RAC grant for treatment, and we hope to find out in May and get funding to help these landowners treat their lands. So definitely we need people with time and energy who want to be involved, to engage with landowners, agency people, to keep the momentum going. So please join the Shiny Geranium Working Group, help us strategize, help us educate, help develop long-term relationships with landowners and agency folks, help us survey and treat. And here's my contact information. Please call me, email me. I am happy to answer questions, happy to hear how you can assist. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cecile. That was really thorough, and I feel like that is great information to have about where populations are and what people can do about them. I was writing my own question just now, and we can all save those for the end, and hopefully we can have a discussion about that. And I want to let Suzie know you can start taking sharing your screen and getting your slides going.
Okay.
Yeah, and if folks want Cecile's information moving forward, I know she put it up there, you can contact any of us to get you in touch with Cecile. But yeah, I'm gonna let Suzie give her talk. Thank you so much for joining us, Suzie.
All right, thank you. So hi everyone, welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight for this important topic in the Siskiyou Mountains. As Vanessa explained, I've been monitoring grazing allotments on the Siskiyou Crest for many years now, along with my husband, Luke, who runs the Siskiyou office of Klamath Forest Alliance, and also in collaboration with the Grazing Reform Project based out of Northern California that does really important work. The photos you see tonight, unless otherwise noted, are photos taken by me and Luke, and he's participating in the meeting tonight and may chime in at the end if there's time. We spend a lot of time hiking, botanizing, and monitoring on the Siskiyou Crest. So I have a lot to share tonight. As Vanessa also mentioned, I live within the upper Big Applegate grazing allotment in the Siskiyou Mountains Ranger District, and have cattle in my front yard every fall, as seen in this photo, where they're trampling my beautiful silver lupins and roadside native pollinator gardens. So I have some intimate experience here. No presentation about public land grazing in the Siskiyou Mountains would be complete without touching on the history of grazing. So hog drives across the Siskiyous started occurring in the 1850s. Hundreds of hogs were run over the Siskiyou Crest to Chinese miners on the Klamath River, and were also butchered and packed out. Cattle grazing began in the 1860s, followed by sheep grazing. Cattle, at least, were turned loose on the open range with little supervision, with the result that prime grazing areas were overgrazed. According to Stories on the Land, in 1903, there was a staggering 103,000 sheep and 7,500 cattle that grazed the area on the Siskiyou Crest between Siskiyou Summit and Highway 199. So the historic impacts of grazing in the Siskiyou Mountains are well documented. This photo that I'm sharing here is from 1915, and the description by early Forest Service official J.E. Gribble reads, 1,800 head of sheep returned to night camp from grazing on the west slope of Mount Ashland. And the summit of the mountain is in the background, and the erosion gullies are in the foreground. So you can see the erosion gullies here that were already forming as early as 1915. The Ashland Woolen mills, which were originally called the Rogue River Woolen Manufacturing Company, began operations in Ashland in 1868. And by 1884, it had a capacity of 16,000 pounds of wool a month and was run 24 hours a day. So it needed access to a lot of wool. Ed Abbott, range specialist for the Rogue River National Forest, said that between 1870 and 1908, sheep were not regulated at all on the Siskiyou Crest. Herds of tens of thousands grazed there. Early fire lookouts were taught to distinguish between brown smoke, which was the dust raised by these huge herds, and blue smoke from fires. Sheep were increasingly regulated until in the 1940s, herds were limited to 1,000 to 2,000 ewes with lambs, and sheep were only allowed to camp in any one spot for 3 days. This photo, also from 1915, shows erosion at Grouse Gap near Mount Ashland due to sheep grazing. You can see the erosion gullies here all coming down from Grouse Gap, and this is in highly erosive granitic soils. So as early as 1915, there was documentation of erosion from grazing in the Siskiyou Mountains that was damaging to the ecology of the area. A US Forest Service report in 1917 describes Siskiyou Summit as, quote, badly overgrazed and in need of reseeding. C.E. Brown, in his 1971 Forest Service document, History of the Rogue River National Forest, Volume 2, explained that in 1918, 12,000 sheep were permitted between Studhorse Creek and Dunmore Meadows alone. And Brown's comment regarding grazing during this time period was, quote, at the end of the season, the whole area was a dustbed. During World War I, a total of some 8,000 head of cattle were permitted on the Applegate district. This number was gradually reduced to approximately 1,800 head in 1944. This photo from 1930 shows roundup time along the Siskiyou Crest in what was referred to as the Ashland unit. So-called range improvements that included vegetation control using herbicide was common and well documented. Brush control spraying was documented in the 1960s. This was used to kill off native alder glades to grow more grass for livestock and to kill native wildflowers such as false hellebore and Sierra or mountain larkspur that were deemed poisonous to livestock. Non-native grass seed was also spread far and wide as these range improvement programs. Both historic and modern grazing infrastructure can be found all over within grazing allotments in the Siskiyou Mountains. Troughs, salting stations, corrals, etc., are set up on these public land allotments. Sometimes even trailers are parked for years, as seen in this photo here. For context, I wanted to share a map of federal grazing allotments throughout the West. This map is from 2008, but it's probably still pretty accurate, I'd imagine. As you can see, the scale of public land grazing in the West is pretty massive. The grazing allotments in the Siskiyou Mountains are here. So we're right here along the California-Oregon border. And you can also see here that there's virtually no other grazing allotments west of I-5 in Oregon. I don't know if this little speck here is still active or not, but pretty much just our region is the only region west of I-5 that has public land grazing allotments. So the Siskiyou Crest is this remarkable high elevation ridge system that ties the Coast Range to the Cascades. And the top of the crest marks the boundary between the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest on the north side and the Klamath National Forest on the south side. A current map that shows all the active allotments on the Siskiyou Crest is not currently available, and the allotments are really quite complex. I'm going to show the maps that I have access to, including this one from KS Wild that's a little old, but it's helpful in that it clearly shows how the allotments essentially encompass the entire eastern Siskiyou Crest. So on this map, the Oregon-California border is here, and the PCT, the Pacific Crest Trail, is running like this, like that. And the PCT roughly marks the boundary between the two national forests. The Rogue side manages some of California here that has Oregon watersheds, meaning the streams flow into Oregon and vice versa. So in this area over here near Siskiyou Peak, the Klamath National Forest manages some parts of Oregon that are California watersheds where the streams flow south into California. So we have two states, two national forests, and it's just very bureaucratically complex. And the cattle drift between the two national forests is a really huge problem. The cows don't stay on the allotments they're supposed to stay on. This is an ongoing problem that's led to lawsuits due to the inability to manage the allotments according to their management plans and directives. Most of the permittees for these grazing allotments are local, with home ranches in the Applegate or on the Klamath River. However, a couple are not local. The Elliott allotment that is upstream from where I live has cows trucked in from Montague, about 2.5 hours away. And the Upper Big Applegate allotment that I live within now has a permittee registered in Los Molinos, California, with no local home ranch associated with the allotment as they're supposed to have. So this map shows the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest allotments with information about the 2020 stocking levels. This allotment here, the Big Grayback allotment, was bought out in 2014 and is closed. And the Carberry allotment here is vacant, and it should stay vacant. So that leaves 5 allotments on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest side of the Siskiyou Crest. There's an additional spring range allotment on BLM land called Lower Big Applegate. That's not on this map. But the numbers work out to about 926 cows on the north side of the Siskiyou Crest in the summer on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. This map of the Klamath National Forest allotments this is the map of the Klamath National Forest allotments in the Siskiyous. For reference, this is the general area that we're talking about here. And I'm gonna zoom in on the allotment map itself. So as you can see, one allotment is vacant here, the Johnny Syed allotment. And I couldn't find complete information. It can be really difficult to find information about these grazing allotments. A lot of it is not publicly available, and you have to do Freedom of Information Act requests to get information. And I couldn't find complete information for Horse Creek and Dry Lake because there's actually multiple permittees, and I can only find information for one permittee each for those. But in general, you can estimate that there's about 688 cows, probably more, on the Klamath side. So, the totals, so Rogue River Siskiyou side has 926, the Klamath National Forest has 688, each on 5 allotments. So total, there's 10 allotments and approximately 1,600 cows, but probably higher if I had complete information. The so-called Applegate Grazing Complex, encompassing 4 allotments in the Applegate watershed, was supposed to have a full environmental analysis in spring of 2017, and the Siskiyou Mountains Ranger District even put out a scoping notice, but they haven't followed through with the analysis, unfortunately. Most of these grazing allotments have not updated their allotment management plans since the 1960s. In fact, they haven't been updated since before humans first set foot on the moon in 1969. So a lot has changed in that time, including our understanding of the ecological impacts of public land grazing. These allotments are in desperate need of environmental analysis that uses modern science and updated field knowledge that's been gained over the past 60 years. The Klamath National Forest is in the process of updating some of their allotment management plans through environmental analysis, but unfortunately their analysis has fallen short, and they're currently going back to the drawing board after getting sued by conservation organizations because they didn't analyze the ecological impacts of cattle drift across the grazing allotment boundaries. Their current analysis project is the Oak Knoll Range Project, and you can see from this map that they are attempting to analyze the cattle drift as seen in this highlighted area here on the map. So this is the main area where the cattle drift back and forth. So we'll see how this unfolds. The process isn't over yet. And as Siskiyou Chapter Conservation Chair, I submitted a comment on the Oak Knoll Range project for our chapter and participated in a formal objection meeting. One of the big things that I was advocating for was using GPS technology to track the lead cow of the herds, so cattle drift can be monitored remotely and more easily. Currently, the response time for permittees to respond to their cattle drifting outside their allotment is pretty dismal, and cows even ended up in the Ashland watershed this summer, all the way over from the Klamath's East Beaver allotment. So better use of technology could be a really good thing. So I'm going to share photos for a select few of the allotments, but as I go through topics throughout the presentation, I made an effort to list which allotments the photo was taken in for reference. This is Cow Creek Glade in Oregon near Observation Peak. Cow Creek Glade is in the Klamath's East Beaver allotment. This is Dunmore Meadows in Oregon, which is on the Rogue River Siskiyou side, and it's in the Beaver Silver allotment. If you've ever hiked the Siskiyou Crest through on the PCT, you've hiked through Dunmore Meadows. It was recently entirely private land, but a large portion of the meadow system has been acquired by the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest and is now public land. Dunmore Meadows is a spectacular meadow system, and the acquisition is really good for the PCT. However, there is active grazing in the area, which creates problems for water sources for hikers because the cows do defecate in the water sources. I want to point out that the type of grazing management that is occurring in the Siskiyou Mountains is referred to as passive season-long grazing. What this means is that there's virtually no management. The cows are dropped off on or near their permitted on date and then picked up at the end of the season on or near the off date. But much of the time they don't get the cows off the allotments until well after the official off date in the fall. So there are no cowboys with the herds, and there is very little management. These cows in Dunmore Meadows essentially spend most of the summer grazing in and around this one area. If a Forest Service range specialist asks the permittees to move the cows from one area to another to limit ecological impacts, or if they are drifting into an adjacent allotment, the permittees may move the cows as asked. But these cows can end up in really remote places and can be hard to track. And oftentimes, if a public citizen makes a complaint, the Forest Service and the permittees will not take action until the complaint is verified by Forest Service personnel. And by the time that process plays out, the cows can be pretty hard to find. This is Silver Fork Basin in Oregon and also in the Beaver Silver allotment. Cows can be found in this meadow system virtually all summer, and the area is in drastic need of more herd management and rotation. I'll be talking more about Silver Fork Basin in the next series of slides. I wanted to point out the identifying features on these cows. So both national forests use different systems. The Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest cows generally only have bells on the lead cow of the herd, and the bells are on chains around the cow's neck. Whereas most adult cows on the Klamath National Forest allotments have bells, and their bells are attached to straps around the neck. So sometimes you can identify them just based on whether they're Klamath cows or Rogue River Siskiyou cows, whether they have straps or chains. The ear tags are supposed to be uniform to help with identification, but the Forest Service doesn't enforce the ear tag colors, at least on the rogue side. So there are lots of different colors of ear tags, and we have requested that the ear tags be uniform to help with identification to make it easier to know when cows are drifting outside their permitted allotment. So there's many ecological issues associated with public land grazing in the Siskiyou Mountains, and I'm going to start with erosion. So this is another view of Silver Fork Basin at the headwaters of Elliott Creek on the Siskiyou Crest in between Dutchman Peak and Observation Peak. This is Observation Peak here and Mount Shasta in the background. Silver Fork is a gorgeous basin that is symbolic of the Siskiyou Crest, where vegetation communities collide and mix. And there are many rare, endemic, and special plant species in the area. Within this photo, it's also highlighting the designated Dutchman Peak and Observation Peak botanical areas. And I'll be talking more about botanical areas later in the presentation. So the reason why I'm highlighting Silver Fork Basin is that it's emblematic of the ecological issues with passive season-long grazing on the Siskiyou Crest. Because grazing has been so excessive in Silver Fork Basin in the past, massive erosion was occurring. A CCC crew constructed check dams in the erosion gullies in Silver Fork Basin as early as 1937, according to the History of the Rogue River National Forest. And then in 1958, the Forest Service took the drastic measure of digging massive contour trenches on about 30 acres at the head wall of the scenic basin and seeded the area with non-native grasses. So in these photos here, you can see the contour trenches in here. And this photo is not so clear, but you can see the trenching here. It's pretty easy to see when you're pretty close up. I'll go back to the previous slide. The contour trenching is actually in this area right here. You can't see it very well when you're far away. And what happened actually is that when they did this contour trenching, the soil disturbance really stimulated conifer seedling growth, and the trenched area is now covered in young forest, where it presumably was probably just part of the meadow system before the grazing-induced erosion began. Unfortunately, Silver Fork still gets badly overgrazed each summer. Stocking numbers are less than they were historically, thankfully, but the area needs a long rest from grazing in order to fully restore the native plant communities in the basin. For historical context of the overgrazing that has occurred in the Silver Fork Basin, we can look back at historic records. In 1917, the description was, quote, "O'Brien and Bigelow areas so badly depleted they have been closed. Siskiyou Summit, Silver Fork, and Freeze-Out areas are badly overgrazed and in need of reseeding. Cottonwood Glade range is also overgrazed." And in 1918, the description was, quote, "Several areas reported overgrazed, Silver Fork, Bigelow Creek, Condi Glades, and others." Erosion control has been a major issue in many of the allotments on the Siskiyou Crest. This was a gully erosion restoration attempt on the Glade Creek allotment. These areas with high erosion that were historically turned into dust beds and have never recovered are referred to as cattle barrens because they have been turned into barren areas due to cattle and grazing impacts. If you hike the PCT across the Siskiyou Crest, you will see these erosive areas. They're very visible in many locations, especially in the Mount Ashland Siskiyou Peak area and in the Condrey Mountain Schist area. Now I want to address compaction and downcutting. These photos show soil compaction. So note that high levels of bare ground in the center of these photos that's caused by livestock use. This is also in the Silver Fork Basin. The bare soil surfaces exhibit diagnostic signs of compaction and erosion. These impacts reduce meadow productivity and adversely affect riparian, soil, watershed, and meadow functions. These photos are highlighting the downcutting along the streams. The major loss of stream shade together with stream widening elevates water temperatures both here and downstream. The severe bank damage also greatly elevates sediment delivery. The loss of vegetation along the stream banks caused with livestock trampling and browse also contributes to bank instability. So now we're going to take a look at botanical issues and botanical areas on the Siskiyou Crest. Because of the world-class botanical diversity and large amounts of endemic and rare plants on the Siskiyou Crest, many botanical areas have been designated in order to help manage and preserve the botanical diversity. This photo is of Lees Lewisia. It's a rare plant that inhabits serpentine soil within the Red Mountain Botanical Area, which is also located in the Wagner allotment. And this is a list of the 11 designated botanical areas that overlap with grazing allotments on the Siskiyou Crest. Only one botanical area, the Dutchman Peak Botanical Area, ever had a completed botanical area management plan created, as was directed in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest Land and Resource Management Plan of 1995. And that plan, the Dutchman Peak Botanical Area Management Plan, directly states that grazing utilization levels should be consistent with and benefit botanical values, which they aren't unfortunately really following. So one important recommendation is that grazing managers need to incorporate the botanical area values into the annual operating instructions, which are the annual instructions the Forest Service gives to the permittees for each allotment. And I just want to point out that this photo is of House Tauscha, which is a really cool rare plant located on Siskiyou Peak, which is in the Mount Ashland Siskiyou Peak Botanical Area on the Klamath National Forest, and it's also located within the East Beaver allotment. So one of my favorite rare plants, Jane's Canyon buckwheat, grows on dry soils in limited places on the Siskiyou Crest. Plants are routinely trampled and soil is compacted or all around the plants, limiting the seedling survival and plant distribution for a rare plant that already has a limited distribution. These photos show Red Cow Camp on the Siskiyou Crest, which is right at the boundary of the two forests and two different allotments, which means the cattle consistently drift from one allotment to the other. The cows especially like to drift from the drier south side of the crest to the northern, more moist side of the crest. One thing to keep in mind is that for most other activities on public land, such as logging, road construction, trail construction, etc., rare plant inventories and buffers are part of routine management and environmental analysis. That isn't the case for grazing allotments. There is no consideration or buffer zones given to rare plant populations, no matter how rare or sensitive the plant may be. So now I'm going to move on to a more common species, quaking aspen. Although common throughout the West, quaking aspen only grows in about 9 locations on the Siskiyou Crest, making it an uncommon species, especially the more west you go. So aspen can produce whole stands of trees vegetatively, spreading via roots and shoots. These stands of trees can comprise a single clone. So vegetative reproduction of aspen is key to its survival and growth patterns. Unfortunately, cattle in numerous aspen stands on the Siskiyou Crest are virtually making it impossible for the trees to reproduce. Aspen stands often grow in preferred cattle areas near wetlands. So the cattle just hang out in the aspens and both chew down and trample the shoots. This photo series is of quaking aspen out in Alex Creek on the Elliott allotment on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. This is a view looking down into the aspen stand here. And then you can see in these photos all these dead stems that were the aspen trying to send up new shoots, but they're just getting eaten down and trampled. The same thing is occurring in aspen stands in Lower Cow Creek Glade in the East Beaver allotment on the Klamath National Forest. So you can see the same thing, the shoots are just all eaten and they're dying out, and just the trees are just having a really hard time reproducing. So that leads us to wetlands. This photo is of Lower Alex Hole on the Elliott allotment, which is also, this wetland here is right down in this spot here. So it's near the quaking aspen, this wetland here. And you can see that there's punching and trampling of the wetland from cattle in here. So livestock caused soil compaction affects the ability of soils to store and release water. In a research paper by Kaufman et al. From 2004, they estimated that soils compacted by grazing lost the ability to store about 13,000 gallons of water per acre in just the top 4 inches of soil in wet meadows. So we're specifically talking about wet meadows. They also documented that soils that had undergone some degree of recovery from compaction due to about 18 years of grazing exclusion could store about 20% more water, much of which would ultimately discharge to streams than soils that continued to be subjected to grazing. So these are extremely significant impacts. The loss of water storage in wetland soils due to compaction contributes to reductions in low flows in streams. This is a critical issue as we face more impacts from climate change going into the future. In much of the American West, national forest grazing is concentrated in headwater meadow systems that have wetlands at their core. The impact of grazing on meadow streams and water tables has been well documented. Trampling of headwater wetlands lowers the water table and dries out the wetlands, resulting in loss of water storage, increased flood flows, and decreased dry season base flows in streams issuing from these meadows. When many headwater meadows in a watershed are grazed, the impacts can be significant far downstream, where salmon habitat is also found. These effects of soil compaction from livestock grazing are likely some of the reasons that cessation of livestock grazing in riparian areas has been shown to increase summer stream flow. Assessments have repeatedly noted that the elimination of livestock grazing is one of the most promising means for increasing and restoring low flows in streams. Soil compaction is extremely persistent, requiring several decades in the absence of additional impacts for full recovery. Because livestock grazing occurs annually, soil compaction is cumulative, and it increases the compaction and prevents its recovery, and contributes to the loss of plant growth and summer stream flows. Compaction and erosion of headwater streams from livestock grazing impacts water quantity and quality downstream for threatened species such as coho salmon. Monitoring of long-term vegetation transects on California National Forest grazing allotments from the southern Sierra Nevada mountains to the Modoc Plateau and the Oregon border documents the long-term loss of wetland obligate plants. So plants that rely on wetlands decline in national forest grazing allotments. Wetland obligate plants include non-vascular plants that can also be impacted by livestock grazing. This is a list of some of the special status non-vascular plants in wetlands within the Siskiyou Crest grazing allotments. In the summer of 2010, surveys were conducted by Scott Loring and Clint Emerson at Hinkle Lake as part of the report Inventory of Rare Bryophytes in Unique Wetland Ecosystems on the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. This was published through the Interagency Special Status and Sensitive Species Program in 2010. And the report documents Alpine Liverwort near Kendall Cabin in wetlands in the Hinkle Lake Botanical Area. Alpine Liverwort is very rare and is found in only 6 locations worldwide, 4 in Oregon, 1 in Alaska, and 1 in Utah. And this one location near Hinkle Lake has no protection from grazing. And there's a push right now by the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest range specialist to once again use Hinkle Lake for grazing, despite the presence of this rare bryophyte or Alpine Liverwort. So efforts should be made to exclude cattle from areas where there are these special status non-vascular plants. This photo series shows Mud Spring and the Middle Hill Complex in the Upper Elliott Creek watershed. This is a series of small wetlands and sphagnum bogs that contain rare bryophytes and other non-vascular plants. These photos were taken during a field trip to the area to look at grazing and OHV impacts to the wetlands with District Ranger Donna Mickley and Forest Supervisor Merv George. Cattle use of riparian areas and wetlands will increase if we have more droughts into the future with climate change. Last fall, as available forage for cattle decreased in early fall, cattle literally spent their days walking along the middle fork of the Applegate River eating torrent sedge because it was the only available forage. This is torrent sedge right here, which is a common sedge that grows within the streams. So this is, can also be looked at as an animal welfare issue. I felt terrible for these cows that they were so desperate for food at that time that they were relying on torrent sedge, which doesn't seem that palatable, that they were relying on that for food. When cattle and other livestock graze in springs, other wetlands, and within riparian areas, they deposit bovine waste directly into streams. The result is fecal bacterial pollution, often in violation of standards established to protect public health and comply with the Clean Water Act. In Northern California, the Quartz Valley Indian Reservation has documented violations of fecal bacteria and nutrient water quality standards in Klamath National Forest streams issuing from grazing allotments. Similar violations have been documented in the central Sierra Nevada mountains and in other public land grazing locations across the American West. And it's very possible that our local grazing allotments are doing the same, just nobody's testing. And Giardia is no joke, so always filter or treat water when in areas where there's grazing. The next topic is dryland habitat and bunchgrass communities. I would like to make a special mention of the importance of dryland habitat that includes native bunchgrass, dry meadows, flower-filled dry ridgelines, and the buckwheat fields where dryland species find their niche. Livestock grazing has altered historic bunchgrass communities over the past 100+ years, diminishing both the acreage and complexity of bunchgrass habitat on the Siskiyou Crest. Livestock routinely turn dry areas into dusty cattle barrens where only increaser species can survive and spread. Intact native bunchgrass habitat is super important for botanical and wildlife habitat diversity. The Natural Resource Conservation Service recommends deferred rotation, rest rotation, and intensive deferred rotation as grazing systems appropriate for native bunchgrasses, and passive continuous grazing as inappropriate because it results in the elimination of native bunchgrasses from the preferred locations where unherded livestock remain for long periods. So in other words, in order to protect native bunchgrass communities, constant grazing is not compatible. Erosive soils are common on the Siskiyou Crest, such as granite and schist. Cattle barrens are often just bare soil, but can sometimes support pussy paws and parasitic dodder and other species that are really adapted to constant soil disturbance. And in Slaughterhouse Flat, which is this photo here, which isn't too far from where I live, we first started visiting this meadow system here about 20 years ago, and it was very barren, but it hasn't had cows in at least 15 years. And at first, when we first started visiting it, there was mainly just pussy paws and bare soil and dodder. But since this area hasn't been grazed, it's really starting to recover and turn back into native bunchgrasses. So long-term rest of the allotments could restore cattle barrens back to bunchgrass and wildflower habitat. Now we're going to look at issues around public land grazing that affect pollinators, birds, and wildlife. The Sierra Nevada blue butterfly is a sensitive species in Oregon that relies on high elevation shooting stars as larval host plants. These species grow in wetlands, making the Sierra blue butterfly reliant on wetland habitat. Unfortunately, cattle trample and eat these shooting stars right at the time when when the Sierra blue butterfly eggs and larvae are on the plants, impacting the populations of this beautiful butterfly. I want to highlight the work of Linda Kappen, who I think is on the Zoom today. I think I saw her enter the room. She's a resident of the Applegate Valley, and she's done a lot of great work to document Sierra blue butterflies in wet meadows in the Siskiyous. She has furthered our understanding of where the butterflies live and also the impacts that cattle can have on them. There are lots of other important pollinator species that I would have liked to have highlighted in this presentation that are also impacted by grazing, such as Western and Franklin's bumblebees and other species, but I just don't have the time tonight. But I do want to highlight the Willow Flycatcher, and as one of our species of concern, it's sensitive in Oregon and endangered in California. And this bird, the Willow Flycatcher, has experienced declines in part due to the loss and degradation of the riparian shrub habitat that they rely on. They require a dense continuous or near continuous shrub layer, especially of willows. You can see in this photo here that all the brown amongst this willow is willows that are dying out because of cattle trampling and browse going on in these willow stands. So the cattle break up the continuous shrub layer, and that impacts habitat for willow flycatchers. Dense willow stands are breeding habitat for the willow flycatcher, which is also a management indicator species for the Forest Service. The Klamath National Forest is supposed to be doing breeding ground surveys, but instead the breeding grounds are unfortunately getting really impacted by cattle grazing. So in these photos, you can see where there used to be a lot of willow. The willow's just all dying out. This stream kind of flows through here, and this is what it looks like up close. There's just the bones of the willows remain, and they're just trampled and dying out. So streambake alteration occurs when cattle walk along the stream banks or across streams. The animal's weight can cause shearing that results in direct breakdown of the stream bank and damage to vegetation. It's common for the shearing action of the hoof to break off a large portion of the stream bank and kill riparian vegetation. The dropping water table from compaction and downcutting can also kill off the willows, because if they just have less access to water, then they'll die from that as well. Here's willow habitat degradation in Cow Creek Glade as well. You can see all the dead brown stems because the cows just punch their way through here and just trample and eat everything down, and it just kills off the willows. Non-native cattle eat very different plants than native wildlife, as determined in diet overlap and social interaction among cattle, deer, and elk in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument. When fecal analysis studies were performed to further understand the impacts of livestock grazing on the monument, fecal analysis from animals within the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument showed that wetland plants comprise 45% of cattle fecal matter, whereas deer and elk show very little wetland plants in their fecal matter. So Luke and I had a game camera up at this beautiful little pond at the headwaters of Elliott Creek for about 2 months this summer, and the elk only came through one time in that whole 2 months. So the elk don't stay in one meadow system for long periods like cattle do. The cattle will just take up shop and just stay in one meadow, and it really tramples the meadow system. Thankfully, cows don't graze this little particular location, so it's in really good shape. And I also wanted to mention that telemetric studies in the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument that were put on, so GPS technology that was put on cows and elk and deer, that also showed that elk will avoid water sources where cattle are grazing. So the elk basically prefer not to be around the cows, and that impacts their ability of elk to access water sources and other preferred locations. So I want to address utilization and cattle exclosures. Exclosures are constructed to keep cattle out of sensitive areas, And there's not many of them. There's only a few on the Siskiyou crest, and sometimes they're not in good shape and don't function. This is an exclosure in Dead Cow Creek on the dry lake allotment. You can see from the photos that the vegetation is eaten down to stubble outside the cattle exclosure. And within the fenced area, the plants are able to flower, go to seed, and reproduce. You can also see here trampling of the wetland here, but on the inside of the fence, the wetland is not trampled. This is the difference between the utilization on the inside versus the outside of the exclosure. So these plants are able to go to seed and reproduce. It's hard to see in this photo here, but marsh grass of Parnassus is blooming in profusion. It's just really small and kind of blends in. But within the area that the cattle are excluded, this beautiful little wildflower just blooms in profusion. But outside the exclosure, there's just no plants that can flower. They're just all eaten down. And so that really impacts pollinators. You know, a lot of these plants are loved by native bees, and so where the cows are just eating all the flowers in these wet meadows, there's just a lack of pollinator habitat, and the plants can't flower, set seed, or reproduce. This is documentation of utilization in different locations in allotments on the Siskiyou crest from 2016. So it just shows the different meadows and the amount of how much cows are utilizing the forage there. This is the Alex Hole exclosure, which was constructed by KS Wild, which shows the same thing, that utilization on the inside compared to the outside. And you can see that on the inside, this is in fall, so the plants are kind of starting to senesce some, but the plants are able to go to seed and to reproduce. Although these exclosures are important to protect small areas from cattle grazing, and they demonstrate valuable information about cattle utilization in the areas they're constructed, they're just Band-Aids, and we really need to larger grazing reform to protect these beautiful meadow systems in the Siskiyous. Cattle on public land grazing allotments move invasive plant species around the landscape. Dyer's woad, pictured here, is moving into the Rogue and Applegate valleys and has been detected coming over the Siskiyou crest at Ward's Fork, where cattle are spreading multiple species of invasive plants. Dyer's woad is unfortunately very established on the Klamath side of the Siskiyou crest, and more work needs to be done to stop its spread northward into the Rogue side of the Siskiyou crest. Another invasive species that cattle are spreading near Ward's Fork is purple hound's tongue. The Forest Service has been battling the spread of this species for some years now, but it's just continuing to spread. So how do we bring public land grazing into the 21st century? There's a lot to do. Modern active grazing management, especially rest rotation grazing and regular herding, prevents unacceptable levels of degradation of water quality, riparian areas, and wetlands, and protects special status native species. Rest rotation consists of cessation of grazing in areas where grazing is having negative impacts in order to allow the area to recover. Regular herding helps move the livestock around the allotment to prevent their congregating in one area for so long that excessive damage occurs there. The Forest Service and BLM actually have some really good guidelines and best management practices for grazing management. They just don't really enforce it or follow their own guidelines. So if we could at least get them to follow more of their best management practices and guidelines, I think we'd be in better shape. So habitat restoration of degraded meadows in the Siskiyou Mountains is badly needed. There's a big opportunity for nonprofits to engage in native plant habitat restoration, like seen here at the Hart Mountain Wildlife Refuge in Eastern Oregon. These before and after photos are really good because they show what can happen after 18 years of no grazing. So the before photos up here show the down cutting, the erosion, the bank instability, and the lack of riparian vegetation on the stream due to grazing. And after 18 years of rest, the banks are stabilized, the willows are returning, and they're looking much better. The buyout and closure of the big grayback allotment in 2014, which coincided and was in conjunction with the expansion of the Oregon Caves National Monument and Preserve, has allowed the Bigelow Lakes Basin to recover from years of grazing. In fact, soon after grazing ceased, Linda Kappen found Sierra Nevada or Sierra blue butterflies for the first time in the Bigelow Lakes Basin, presumably because they were able to better reproduce without grazing of their shooting star larval host plants. So Bigelow Lakes is a restoration success story in the Siskiyou Mountains after the grazing allotment was closed. So, and now Bigelow Lakes Basin is also part of the expanded Oregon Caves National Monument and Preserve. So that's a really good success story. We need more scientific study of the area's flora, fauna, and ecological function. There's a lack of research on the Siskiyou Crest where these grazing allotments are located, and we really need more studies of the area. Also, conversations and advocacy with the Forest Service and BLM that manage the grazing allotments is also key. This photo shows an ad hoc meeting we had with the Klamath National Forest at Alex Hole on the L8 allotment, when we were coincidentally out monitoring the allotment on the same day they were. So we got to have a good discussion in the field about the area. So more discussions like that would be really valuable. So that brings us to the conclusion of the presentation. I didn't cover many important topics, but this at least gives you an overview of public land grazing in the Siskiyou Mountains. And with that, I'll open it up to questions and discussion, and I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Suzie. I'm opening up the chat to, I think there was one question about whether or not this will be recorded from Autumn Scott, because there's a lot of great information in here. I'm also taking notes on like places to go hiking.
Yeah. It's really a beautiful place. I actually really kind of hate having to talk about this issue because there's so much beauty out there, but it's an important ecological issue that needs to be addressed. So,
and it's true when you go hiking and then I saw the Alex Hole exclusion, and it's quite stark. So Joy Savoie asks, who would we write to about this issue? And Susan Russ says, really informative and well presented. Many thanks. But yes, keep putting your questions into the chat box, folks.
You know, I actually meant to put a slide at the end that had some contact information for that, and maybe just in the chat real quick, I'll put my email address. People are welcome to email me, and if somebody else has contacts for the Forest Service at their fingertips and wants to add that into the chat, we can do that too. But I'll add my email into the chat right now.
Great. Kent Patrick Riley is asking if there's anything that the Forest Service is doing right now in the Crest area regarding grazing.
I mean, they do, in the sense that, you know, when the problems arise, they do talk to the permittees. They might, you know, try, like, especially if there's cattle drift, they will ask the permittees to move the cattle. You know, a lot of it is there's not a lot of enforcement of the management regulations and rules, especially, you know, it's kind of one of those situations that unless somebody complains, you know, nothing's really done about it. So actually, if you see cows that are not, if you suspect that they're not on the right allotment, or if you see damage from cows that's really excessive, or if you see them when you think they shouldn't be there, like they're not supposed to be up on the Siskiyou Crest up into the high country, and I think until the beginning of July. And so, you know, if you see them up there early or even too late, you know, like being able to contact the Forest Service, they are supposed to take action on that. Sometimes it can be hard to get them to take action, and it's hard to even sometimes get information. I'd say that the Rogue River Siskiyou side is actually harder to get information out of than the Klamath. But yeah, I mean, there's things that they are doing, but there's definitely a lot more that should be done. In fact, you know, in a lot of my research of the history, they used to actually have to, the Forest Service had to actually be there when the cows were put on the range and counted. And they don't do that anymore. You know, they were doing that as early as like the 40s, you know, or something, and they don't do that anymore. It's really just kind of a lot of trust of the permittees. And I think probably more trust than they probably should give them, because you know, there's a lot of areas that are getting trampled that there needs to be more herding.
Great. And I think that question and your response ties well into Julie, I think it's Speletic.
Speletic.
She asks, what can we do to encourage the Forest Service to enact healthier grazing practices?
You know, letters and emails and phone calls to the Forest Service make a big difference. When they hear people complaining, you know, a lot of times they will take action. And I'd say on a level, the allotments that are closer to like Mount Ashland, where there's more people that visit the area, those are the allotments that get the most attention, because there's more people there and more people that contact the Forest Service of issues that they see arise. Some of the allotments that are more remote, you know, less people are there, and so they don't get as much attention, but they all have problems going on. So I would just say, you know, writing letters to the Forest Service or emails or phone calls, any of that is really helpful.
Awesome. And I think you've sparked the public. Christina asks, would NPSO or other organizations be creating a petition or perhaps suggest a meeting? Do we have supportive legislature or any consideration for a rule or bill in the next year?
Oh gosh, that's a huge question. As far as supportive politicians, you know, it's not really an issue that's generally even on their radar. You know, I hate to say it, but we have to make it on their radar because it's federal land management. You know, our local state reps aren't going to really have much sway. I mean, they could write to the federal agencies, to the Forest Service and BLM, but I'm sure their first comment's going to be, well, you know, we don't have much sway with federal land, but you know, if people are interested in starting some kind of letter writing program or something like that, or a petition or something, I'd be happy to start that because I do feel like, you know, a lot of us care about this issue, but it just doesn't get much attention, and it's huge. It affects everything. It affects fish, it affects pollinators, it affects native plants, it affects soils and hydrology. I mean, it's really all encompassing. Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to, you know, maybe when we meet in person as a organization again, we can maybe have a more detailed discussion about how to do that.
And to your point about some actions that people can take, Rachel's commenting that it seems like encouraging the completion of the botanical area management plans could also be helpful.
Yeah, I agree. The national forests are about to undergo a whole new round of renewed forest management plans as a whole. So we could be advocating for that when those new forest management plans come up for renewal.
Right. Kathy asks, do cougar ever help manage these cattle?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't hear very much about cows getting killed by cougars. Maybe somebody else knows more about that than I do. I don't even really hear much about cows on the Siskiyou Crest having like even the calves having problems with depredation by predators. I mean, that might be happening and I just don't know it. I did hear of one cow getting hit by lightning on the Scott Mountain Ranger District one time, which was kind of interesting. It got hit by lightning and killed. But yeah, I don't know how much cougars really go after calves or impact cow movement. It doesn't seem like that really happens, but maybe that's just something that should be studied.
Yeah. I think it seems like in the Applegate people, when neighborhoods notice that there's a cougar around, it seems like people notice, but that is much lower in elevation than some of the areas you're talking about. So Luke is writing also to folks, if you wanted another place to report. If folks see damage on the Siskiyou crest, trespass, or grazing out of season, contact Luke at the Klamath Forest Alliance, siskioucrest@gmail.com is working on documenting these impacts. So you can also contact your local district ranger and Forest Service supervisor. I also encourage folks to reach out to the Grazing Reform Project. So those seem like additional places to express concerns or submit documentation to, which is great.
Perfect.
Pepper Trail writes, when are the grazing allotments up for renewal? Are there legal mechanisms to compel the Forest Service to follow their own grazing regulations?
Yeah, there's probably lots of legal mechanisms, but finding an attorney to take it on for pro bono is a whole nother story. You know, like I mentioned in my presentation, they were about to start some of the environmental analysis on the four of the grazing allotments in the Applegate, and they just didn't follow through with it, and it's never deemed priority. They always say that they've got to work on forest thinning, and they've got to work on fire issues, and they don't have enough funding. And so the grazing program is like bottom of the barrel in terms of funding that the Forest Service gets. And so that's part of it, but I think part of it is just that the public doesn't raise it to the level of pushing them to do it. And there's only a few voices of us out there that contacts them about it every year. But they really don't actually have like anything that actually, I mean, they're supposed to renew them every certain, amount of time, every 20 years or something like that. But there's nothing that really prevents them from just pushing the can down the road, kicking the can down the road. It's really, really frustrating, but legal action would help. So if anybody knows an attorney that wants to take it on, we'd be happy.
And to the point of expressing concern to someone, Caitlin asked who the Forest Service contact would be, and then Luke responded that District Ranger Donna Mickley and Forest Supervisor Merv George, and the emails are in the chat. Leela expresses her gratitude, says the lecture was very informative and interesting. And Christina says we need a movie made about this. And Teresa is imagining that photos and videos of the damage would be useful in reporting.
Yes.
Seems like you're talking about putting social pressure, but also providing some more like quantitative.
Well, and that does bring up a good point that if you do make a complaint, they're going to absolutely ask for photos. They're going to want GPS coordinates. They're going to put you through the rigmarole. Like, you don't have to have that. You can make a complaint without that, but they're going to ask you like where you saw the cows, like what did they have straps? Did they have what kind of bells? They're going to ask you all the identifying features, that ear tags, all those things like really matter. When you do make a report, if you can get that detail. Sometimes it's really hard to get close to the cows. They're kind of scary when they're in big herds, and I've been scared by them many times. And so, if you have a good telephoto lens, that helps, but don't put yourself in danger or anything, but it does help to get those identifying features when you do make a complaint, and photos.
Awesome. And I'm skipping a few. The messages are piling up, but Cecile, I did ask a question about what kind of organic compounds could be used for shiny geranium to Cecile, and she sent a link in the chat. And someone was asking, can the Forest Service and other relevant contact information be put in the YouTube video description? So just continuing to document all of the great resources that people are sharing right now. I think Luke is providing a lot of.
Yeah, we can make sure that I'm pretty sure we can just put that in the description. So yeah, definitely.
Okay. All right. I thought they were piling up, but we got to the end of that. So thank you for that information, Cecile, and all of your answers. Suzie, I think there was one question. Caitlin asked, would more temporary or permanent livestock exclusion fencing be useful in protecting these botanical areas?
I think, in the interim before, while we work towards long-term change and reform of grazing, then yeah, I mean, I think there are specific places where there are rare plants and rare species that are being impacted where that could be really helpful. But those, like I mentioned, like the inventories of those rare plants in terms of the grazing allotments just isn't really even happening. Even in the processes that have happened on the Klamath National Forest, just the rare plants just don't get much attention. It's really quite frustrating. So, but I do think that some actually, getting the permittees to actually really herd the cows so they don't do as much damage as they're doing, and putting in some exclosure fencing to protect some areas, some special high use areas would be really good.
Awesome. And someone, Pepper Trail, okay, Christina is writing that she hopes we can come together to help stop or slow SG, and maybe there could be some calls for volunteers to help. And then Pepper Trail is asking, what about grazing buyouts? How much money would that take? You did mention a buyout in your talk, and I'm curious also, just is it a buyout of the allotment, or it's not the parcel?
It's the allotment. So it's the allotment. Luke might know off the top of his, but I feel like the big grayback allotment was something like $1 million, like it was a lot of money. And that really only, it really came to fruition because of the expansion of the Oregon Caves National Monument too, because they included that area into the caves, or at least parts of it. But buyouts are an option if the permittee is willing. We actually have approached at least one permittee for a buyout, and they never responded. So if they're not willing, buyouts are really impossible. They have to be willing. The permittees have to be willing to retire it, and usually they want a pretty substantial financial compensation, because these allotments do actually, even though it's not their private land, it does add value to their land, because generally speaking, they're tied to a home ranch. And those home ranches have value because they come with those grazing rights. It's kind of like a water right on a level. They're tied to a private property, even though the water right doesn't have to be on the private property. It's the same thing with the grazing right. But I wish that we could explore more buyout options. But it's really hard to find the money that they usually want.
Yes, that's a lot of money. Barb writes, could student groups from SOU help out to study and oversee land use and grazing? So
I would love it if more students from SOU wanted to study that issue. I think that would be really great, and I feel like, the Cascade Siskiyou National Monument area has had a lot of studies because of the monument designation. But the Siskiyou Crest area has not had as much studies. So I feel like the time is ripe for that to really start happening more. I think because SOU doesn't have a straight up botany program anymore, that it's a little tougher to get that kind of work happening with students. But if anybody has ties to make that connection and connections to make that happen, that would be great, because that's exactly the type of thing that we need on the crest. We have folks like Linda. I don't know if she's still on, if she wants to chime in, but Linda just does it volunteer on her own time to do it. But we need actually like more research happening, and students could be a big part of that.
Awesome. And in the realm of connecting with people, I just want to take a second to see if Cecile is still here and wants to answer Christina's question or talk a little bit more about the organic compounds that you were listing some stuff in there, and there was a little back and forth. So if you are here and would like to turn your camera and your mic on, Cecile, Christina was asking if there would be any volunteer call to get people involved with the shiny geranium treatment. And I think we've talked a little bit about that. And if you want to go ahead.
Well, it seems that what really is needed is more longer term committed type of volunteering. So for people to say, I really would love to go knock on landowners' doors in Rouge and get to know them and ask them if I can look around their property. To be partnered with landowners, let's say in the Wagner Creek area that have shiny geranium on their property and want to treat it, but it's overwhelming for them. You know, I think there's so many things that can be done, but we are not going to be organizing weed pulls, things of that nature that might traditionally take place, because in the forest setting, it just doesn't work. I can see it working on people's properties that we can do sheet mulching, that kind of thing. But at this moment, the landowners in Talent have forest, and one property owner has forest and some flat ground, and he's just a superstar, a total superstar, and he is tilling and intends to do sheet mulching, things like that. So longer term volunteers, there's lots of needs. That would be fantastic. But at this point, there isn't going to be like calls for pulls and things like that unless the need arises.
Awesome. I think that was some of the curiosity I had kicking around in my head too, for just what the effort could look like for such a formidable invader. I think folks are thanking both Cecile and Suzie for really informative talks today. I think we got a lot of information, especially about our local regions. This is very like localized, which is a great pairing kind, I think, strangely. Just timing worked out great. If folks have any more questions, feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll just hang around for a second. You can turn your videos on and engage in a more free-form discussion if you all like.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you both for joining us and for giving such thoughtful presentations. Really, really appreciate how succinct.
Out there.
Also, this person, Max McLarnon, mentioned, thank you, Suzie and Cecile, is very informative. As a member of the SOU Biology Club, I can see if anyone would be interested. And Teresa said that would be great, and I just want to echo that. We'd be happy to facilitate any relationships between students and some of the volunteer or botanical work going on. So please reach out to us, Max, if you are seeing people that have interests that are students at SOU.
Great. Perfect.